Okay, so we now go on to dynamic monitors. Dynamic monitors are really important to be able to see what's happening on your machine. It's a bit like looking at the tacho and the speedo and the fuel tank and everything of your car. It's knowing what's going on. And Task Manager is the one that comes with Windows and is really, really very useful. I think it's a very underestimated component, and it's been vastly improved since Windows 7. So from Windows 7 it was a bit crude and clunky, but Windows 10 it's a lot better, and it is really good diagnostic tool to see what's going on. So like I say, it shows how the PC is performing, like the gauges in the car. And then you access it by right-clicking on the taskbar and selecting Task Manager. You can also select it from the Start menu. And you can select performance for CPU, memory, disks, network, and so on. You can select processes to see that are running, both apps and processes. And you can right-click on an app or a process to end a task. If your machine gets really tied in a knot, going around in loops, you can actually kill the loop from within Task Manager. Columns are selectable by right-clicking the headings, and you can reorder from highest to lowest to lowest to highest. You'll see what I mean when we go into it to see the benefits of it. And you can look at what's using the most CPU, what's using the most memory, what's using the most disk, and so on. And the Startup and Services tab is also informative. Another place you can see Startup Services. Okay, let's go to the desktop and have a look at this. So we'll go back to the desktop. Remember, there is two ways you can get through to Task Manager. You can right-click in the taskbar and then left-click on Task Manager, and that will bring it up. Or you can, I'll close it again, or you can go to the Start menu. Right-click on the Start menu and then left-click on Task Manager. Same difference, you get to the same place. Okay, so when it opens, you have these tabs along the top. And the first one shows processes and applications that are running on the machine. So here you've got Google Chrome, and you've got Malwarebytes, and you've got Task Manager itself, which is an app. So these are all listed as apps. And of course the publisher who did them. And then you've got the background processes, a bit like you saw in auto runs. This is 179 processes running. Many of them multiple processes from the same program. You see a VAST, and it's got a background process. Many background processes running, and as you go down, Dropbox, names you'll recognize, Google Chrome, obviously, with lots of background processes, Google Drive, and these are all individual processes. And you can see on the right-hand side, I'll take us back to the top. If we stretch it out a bit, there's no more columns because I've selected only these columns. But you can see the name of the app or process, the type, the publisher, the CPU. This is the individual CPU time or percentage it's taking. This is the memory it's taking. The individual process, and it's showing 75% of the memory is being occupied at the moment, how much disk is being used and how much network is being used by each of these processes. Total being at the top and the individual being down the side. So it's very handy to look at what's consuming what in the machine. So if you, for example, click on the memory heading, it will put the one that's taking the most at the top. So as the top here, Google Chrome's taking the most memory, and then it's all dropping down and down and down and down and down and down. So you're down to 6.4 meg for something down here. But Google Chrome is taking all of this. And the reason that is because this the Screencastify software I'm running runs in Google Chrome. So me making this YouTube is what's consuming all of this, because it's screen recording my machine and storing it away. So you can see why it's taking so much memory. If you click it again, it will put the thing with the lowest memory at the top. And the same with the disk and the CPU. If I click CPU, it will put what's taking the most CPU at the top. So the number's the biggest here and down. So you can see what's being used. And if we go back to name, it just puts them back in alphabetical order, with the apps first and then the background processes. The next most important one I like, and the one I use most, is the Performance tab. And the Performance tab shows a lot of information in graphical form. So this graph on the right-hand side is always CPU when you open it to start with, but you can change it to memory, or you can change it to disk or disk or disk or CPU. So when you open it, it'll always be showing CPU. And this is time 0. So this is time 0. And as it's moving to the left, this is how much CPU is being used, basically every second. So it's taking a measurement every second, with 100% at the top. Okay. So the graph shows you what's happening. So if I open some other application like VLC Media Player, I'll just let this settle, let the spike settle. If I open VLC Media Player, you will see, if I then reduce it to down, you'll see the bump that occurred because I opened another application, and then it settled back down because the application is open. So if I close the application here, close that window, you'll see a little bump because closing it takes a bit of activity, and then it's going back to roughly the same level because of the recording that's going on. So secondly, you can see how much memory. Remember in that previous one it showed the memory was about 80%. And that's represented by that. There's the 80%, 78%. This is the solid state disk that's only running at 1% of 0, 1% 0. These are the other disks in the machine that are all running at 0. This is the Ethernet going out onto the internet, and the graphics processor, and this is the internal one. This is the one that's actually doing the work, the NVIDIA one, which is bypassing that one. So a lot of information, and these graphs can really help you work out what's going on. For example, if this machine was idle, not recording this YouTube, if this machine was idle, this should be down, the CPU should be down like 2 or 3%. It may jump a little bit or drop a little bit, but it'll be roughly running at 2 or 3%, and that's just an idle machine. If we go into something like settings, and I'll just reduce this screen for the moment. Supposing in settings we go and have a look at update and security, and we click on doing a check for updates, you'll see what happens here as to the activity. Suddenly the SSD's gone up to 20%, 22%, and the CPU's gone up to 55%, because it's not only now recording this YouTube screen record, but it's now trying to do a check for updates. So the internet has gone up, CPU has gone up, the disk has gone up. It's doing a lot more work. If I close that and give up doing that, you should see it settle back down again. So it's a good way of seeing what's going on in the machine. See, so this is now settled back to around the 20% because it's now just recording. There is other things along here. You can look at the app history, not terribly interesting. You can have a look at startups that are enabled and disabled. You can look at the users. Remember, there's 2 users on this machine. You can look at other details in terms of the memory and a PID, the ID number of the process that's going on, and you can look at services. But you really need to be interested to follow a lot of that. But in terms of this picture, it's very intuitive. And probably the best example of this is that have a look at this graph when you first boot up the machine. You know, when you start your machine, it often seems quite sluggish and like it's not very attentive to what you want to do. If you can, when you start your Windows 10 or 11 machine, as soon as you get to the desktop, as soon as you're able to get to here, right-click in the taskbar and open Task Manager and go to the performance screen, because it's very intuitive to see what the machine's doing in those first few minutes of it being in operation from when you press the start button. And you'll find that the CPU could be quite high and the memory could be quite high, and in about 5 minutes it should have settled way down to that, what I'm talking about, like a 2% level CPU and possibly a 0% on the system drive, the C drive. If you've only got 4 gig of memory, not 8, then you'll find this runs pretty high. And this is why you really do need at least 8 gig of memory for Windows 10 and 11. A lot of people are putting in 16 gig of memory these days. But the fact that this is so high is really more to do with the fact that I'm screen recording this session. So it would not normally be as high as 6. Okay, so that's Task Manager. Really, really very intuitive. All right, so we'll go back to the dynamic monitors is what we're talking about. Task Manager being the one that comes free with the machine. Really good, really informative, and well worth a look at and spending some time with on your machine, and you'll get used to how your machine looks and how it behaves, particularly those graphs, and you'll get to know a lot more about how hard it's working. Okay, so we might make some observations when running Task Manager. The first one is that when the machine has settled down after first turning it on, you should be looking for an idle CPU usage of between 1 and 3%. Anything in that range is perfectly satisfactory. But remember, initially there will be a lot more activity. So if you go into Task Manager as soon as you can, right when the Windows desktop comes up, you will notice that it's significantly higher than that. The CPU could be up around 10, 20%, and the disk could be running, particularly if it's a spinning hard drive, it could be running at 50, 60, 70, 80%. And that will carry on for quite a few minutes. And it is really worth looking at that so you get a feel for it when you first turn the machine on. But after it's been on 5-10 minutes, it should settle down to, a quiescent period where the CPU is fairly low, between 1 and 3. And you can look at the processes individually, look at CPU by clicking on the heading maybe once or twice. You'll order the CPU or the items in the most CPU usage at the top and the least at the bottom. And the same goes for memory and the same goes for networking. So it's just educational to see what uses the most of these key resources. And finally, you'll have a look at how much memory is free anyway. If you've only got 4 GB installed, it's likely that there might only be 1 GB spare for the applications you're about to open. But if you've got 8 GB installed, you might find there's 3 or more gigabytes spare, which is why putting in more RAM really helps the machine's performance. And if anything looks strange, as in too much disk activity or too much CPU, it really needs to be investigated further. Okay, in investigating further, what you might employ is a piece of software you can download and install. This is another system internals piece of software called Process Explorer. And this is like a super duper task manager. It just allows you to go into far more detail and determine what some of these activities are all about, and particularly looking for any unusual behavior. So Sysinternals, remember this is the company that built a lot of tools and then sold out to Microsoft. And that's why the link here to the software includes Microsoft domain, because it is now part and fully supported by Microsoft. So if we click on this link, it will take you to the web page for Process Explorer from Sysinternals. And like we did with auto runs, you can click on this link here, download Process Explorer, and it will ask you where you want to put it. And as it happens, I've already downloaded it just up here, Process Explorer zip. And we will then go in and open that. So I won't download it again, although it doesn't really matter, but I'll just cancel that. And what we'll do is we'll go down to the downloads folder. So I'll minimize this, the zip file we downloaded. Now, like in auto runs, you double click this and you want to extract all the files. And so I'll click on extract all, and it's going to extract to a folder still in downloads called Process Explorer. And if we say extract, it says there's already been done. So I'll say replace the files because I'd already done it once. And here we are with the Process Explorer exe files. And then all you need to do is click on this one called Process Explorer exe, double click I should say, to execute it, and it will open up. And remember, this is a super function. I'll just get rid of these other screens so it's less confusing. This is like a super version of Task Manager. So you've got all the services down, or the processes down the left-hand side. You've got the amount of CPU that's being consumed and the amount of memory that's been taken. And down here you've got who the publisher is and the description of what it is. So you get a lot more information, and there's even more information available. Now the difference is at the top, this Process Explorer shows the system idle process, and it's showing here 79% idle, meaning it's 20% occupied. Now remember, this is a lot higher than the 3 you would expect, because I'm recording the whole screen for the purpose of making this YouTube. So this machine is working steadily at about 20% in recording this video. But all the services and their individual individual activity can be seen, where it says down here less than 0.01 and so on. Interesting enough, the top one, if I move this down, the top one is registry. Remember, we were going to talk about registry, and just after this item, we'll talk about registry. So it's interesting to know that the registry gets a mention here. And you can look down this list and have a look at all the activities, and there are so many sub-activities within each category. You can right-click on a particular activity and get more information. So if you right-click on, say, this one, you can go down to properties and get even more details about that specific activity and time graphs of what resources it's been taken. And quite interesting too, you can right-click on an activity and search online. So if you're really trying to find out what something is, you can open a search field, and I'll just minimize this, and it says, what is user OODEB broker? And you will find articles to tell you what a particular service or activity is. So that's really, really quite good when you can do that. Obviously in the CPU, you can double click it and show them in order of lowest to highest. And the same with all the other functionalities. If you just want it in alphabetical order, then you just click it on process to get an alphabetical order. So this free piece of software can provide a lot more information as to individual processes that are running. And anything looks a bit strange here, like a suddenly high usage of CPU, needs to be investigated. As you can see, there is an awful lot of processes running at any one time. Most people don't realize what's going on in that machine all the time. So it's just a good way of exploring that sort of thing. Here's the we're back at the presentation now, and the remaining items on here is really the instructions for downloading Process Explorer. So you can click on the download as we did, extract the files, double click the exe file to start the program, and it shows all these things. And column headings are also selectable. Not that interesting. CPU time is another facility that can be shown, and it's actually an accumulated CPU time, which is quite an interesting thing to look at. So since you turn the machine on, how much a particular process has used in total. Not that it's using at the moment, but how much it's used in total. And you can click on the column headings to reorder as required. And remember, system idle process should be 97% idle. Remember, it's the other way around. So in an idle situation, we said the CPU should be less than 3% occupancy. In a sense of idle amount, that should be better than 97% idle. Okay. So let's move on a bit further to Windows Registry, the last section of Get to Know Your PC. Now, the Windows Registry is a store that keeps all the settings of the machine, not only for the user, but for all the software that's on the machine. So if you install something like Adobe Photoshop, it will put entries in the registry associated with that product. and it's where it will store your preferences. So when you go into Adobe Photoshop and you set certain things, it may be the folders that are default folders, or it may be the theme or whatever, it stores those settings in the registry, along with all the other settings associated with Windows, the operating system. So as you can imagine, it's quite a complex store, and nobody really fully understands all the content, because whilst Microsoft developed the concept of the registry store, it's left to the individual manufacturers of software and hardware to a degree to store things in a way they know how to go and get them from the registry. So the input and output is standard, but what is stored and how it's stored is really left to the developer or the manufacturer of the particular item. Obviously, a lot of it is Microsoft based because it runs the operating system, but there is also a lot of other areas that Microsoft wouldn't fully understand and is not really interested in, because it's just for the manufacture of a particular component or piece of software. Now, the danger is that you shouldn't really go into the software unless you really go into the registry unless you really know what you're doing, because whilst you can change things and make dramatic changes that you wouldn't possibly be able to make just through the normal preferences, you can also brick the machine, which means you might make it such that it won't boot up. So there is a danger in going into this without knowing what you're doing. So I will go in just to show you, but we're not going to make any changes. If you have a particular technical issue, you might look up on Google solutions for that issue. And one of the solutions might be from some kind person who suggests that you can go into the registry and modify a value that will fix the solution, fix the problem. But it is dangerous to do that unless you really have good instructions, exact instructions, and you sort of know what you're doing. But a lot of people do. I have probably 2 or 3 dozen times gone in and changed registry values. It seems to be getting less necessary these days than it used to be to solve problems, but it's still a technique that is a lot of people use to fix awkward issues. So we're going to have a look at how it's laid out. To start off with, it's laid out in 5 logical sections, and each section is called an H key, which stands for handle for key, and don't ask me where that came from. Each H key has subkeys, which then can have subkeys of their own. So it's a hierarchical arrangement of data. Any key can have values with different formats, and the 2 formats that are used are decimal and hexadecimal. So if you're not used to hexadecimal, it's actually to the value of 16. So you go 0 to 9, and then you go A, B, C, D, E, F, and F is the highest value in a hexadecimal system. So instead of having just the numbers 0 to 1, 0 to 9, if you like, it goes from 0 to F. And these values in the registry can be either decimal or hexadecimal. And it's not off-putting. It will show you which it is, and you've got to put in the appropriate value. So it is similar to a hierarchical structure of folders and files. A typical one is H key underscore local underscore machine /software /Microsoft, and that's a particular area of the registry. That's how it's expressed. So if we go a bit further, the actual 5 sections, just to give you an idea, HKey classes root, which is for registered applications, i.e. software that you've installed on the machine. HKey current user, which is associated with the currently logged on user for that session only. HK local machine, which is where all the general settings for the computer are, basically the Microsoft or the Windows settings. And HK users, which has information about multiple users that are using that same machine. They are each registered users. And HK, the last one is HK current config, which is settings also for this current user and this current session. So the built-in registry editor is called regedit.exe, and you can get to it by just searching on it under the start, and that's what we're going to do now. And we'll just have a look in the registry without doing anything. And like I said, you need very clear and accurate instructions to do this. I'll just check there's nothing below that, and there's one more. Be very careful not to change values. All right, so we'll go to the desktop now, and if we go down to here, and then the type field down here, we put regedit. You'll see register editor comes up over here. And if we click on that, it will ask you, do you want to allow this app to make changes to the device? And we'll say yes. And this is looking now in the register editor. I'll just shorten that a bit. And here you can see those 5 groups: HKey classes, current local users, and current config. So if we go in the most voluminous areas, generally HK local machine, and within local machine there's all these sub folders, and if we take system for example, we will find there is a lot of other subfolders within this. And if we go to software, you'll find Microsoft and stuff under that, and you can see how it's formed. If we go to another area, if we go into software, you'll recognize names here of third-party software, things like Canon and Dropbox and Epson and Logitech and Macrium and of course Microsoft, Piriform, which is the publisher of CCleaner, and things like Avast. So there's all sorts of stuff in here. If we go into Epson, you'll see something about software updates, and you can see how all of this is structured and the values of words. If I double click one of these, this is a register D word, and if I double click it, I should open it. It's not going to open for me. Modify it. You'll see that the value name is called this, and the value data is 0, and it's hexadecimal. So this is where you have a choice of putting hexadecimal or decimal in. If I look at this default one, it may not open because there's no value, and it's like a default that's there all the time. And in some cases, you might actually be asked to create a new value in one of these folders and put in certain values, which will then fix some issue somewhere. Looking at Bellark, it seems to only have a default there and a default there. It might have something under settings. A lot of them are just default values, but you get the idea, and you should not change anything unless you're certain you know what you're doing. So we'll back out of that. So You don't have to, but the best way I always do is to back out to this point and then just say File, Exit. So you can certainly have a look at what's in the registry, but just don't play around or change anything in there. Okay, we've finished the section on Know Your PC Better. The next section we're going to concentrate on is backups. And backups have got to be the most important thing you do on a machine. I come across it so much that people have not done backups and they lose significant things like photo libraries and goodness knows what, spreadsheets for their finances and so on. So backups are really important, and it is important to know what they are, how to make them, and then to do them regularly. Backups are just a simple copy of important stuff on your machine, and you're storing it away from your machine. So you're making a copy and then storing it away from your machine in case anything happens to the machine. You will still have that information that can be loaded back onto your machine after it's repaired or a new machine. So the whole point about it is that if the original data is lost, corrupted or deleted, you can restore it from the backup. Now, remembering a backup is only as good as the day you made the copy. So if you're doing a financial spreadsheet that you're updating every day and you back it up on Monday of a particular week, by Wednesday, Thursday, Friday, you will have made changes to that copy you made on Monday. But if you lost the lot, having what you had stored on Monday is better than nothing. So it's easy enough to restore that copy from Monday and then just update it with the few days or the month that followed. Whereas if you lose the whole document, you've got to start right from the beginning, create the document and put all the data back in. So a backup is only as good as the last day it was made or when it was made, but that's a lot better than nothing at all. So why backups necessary? Why are these copies necessary? And there's a number of reasons that could cause you to have to restore from a backup copy. Accidental deletion of an original file or folder, I call that an oopsie. So you've accidentally deleted an important file or a folder and you've been fastidious with emptying your recycle bin, and so it has been deleted from there as well. A program fault could cause a file corruption. This used to happen a lot. Word and Excel would often close a document you were working on without an issue and you thought everything was okay until the next time you tried to open it when it couldn't open it because it just said it's corrupted. Well, thanks for telling me at the time, because now I can't get back into all my data. So fortunately, corruptions occurring like that don't happen that often these days. A PC fault could cause a file to get corrupted. So a memory fault even cause it. A power blackout, definitely. So you're in the middle of updating your spreadsheets and suddenly all the power goes, and then that file is left in an unusual position because it's not been saved, and you might find it won't even open when you come to it again. You might have a hard disk fault. Particularly spinning drives have a finite life, and when they decide to give up the ghost, they give up the ghost instantaneously. And the PC could be infected by a virus, and you could have been held to ransom because all your files have been locked up, and you can only get an unlock key by paying a significant amount of money to somebody. And you might have loaded a new program on your machine and suddenly the PC won't boot. And of course, the last of all, the PC might have been lost or destroyed or stolen. So there's all those reasons why a backup is worthwhile, and they're so easy, it's a shame more people don't do them. So what needs to be backed up? Well, there's two groups of information that are important to the smooth running of your machine. The first group is the information you create. So the information you have created since you bought the machine. And that's everything from pictures to emails to documents, Word documents, spreadsheets, and even your passwords. So they're all the things you've created. So that's one group. And the second group is all the information on the machine which is necessary for the machine to run properly. And that comes down to the operating system, the registry, and all the installed programs. So there is two scenarios that could happen here. Scenario one is that your PC is totally destroyed or lost or stolen or whatever. So you've lost the lot. And the obvious solution out of this is to buy a new PC and reload all the software you originally had, and then reload the latest backups of the group one information. So that's one scenario. And scenario two is that the PC won't boot properly that day when you go to the machine and switch it on and you get nothing, or it goes blue screen, or it can't find Windows, or whatever. So that's when the machine itself can't run. And interestingly enough, the information in group one is more than likely perfectly all right. The fact that the machine won't run is because something has gone wrong with the Windows software, not that it has disappeared or your data has disappeared off the disk. It's quite likely that if you took the disk out of that machine and connected to another machine, all of your data is perfectly okay. But unfortunately, the machine won't run. So now you need the backups of the group two, the information that allows the PC to run properly. And the worst case of all of this, worst case of scenario two, is if you can never get the PC to run properly again, you just go back to scenario one. In other words, buy a new machine, reload your data. But hopefully there's a better solution than that. So group one information, all your personal creative stuff, should be stored away from the PC. And the reason for that is if you got broken into and someone stole your computer, it's quite likely they would steal the backup drives that were sitting by it. So you must store your backed up data elsewhere. So what are the backup media choices? Like, what do you store these copies on? There is a number of choices you can do. The group one backups must be stored on removable drive. There's no point in storing it in another part of the machine, for the reasons that if the machine was stolen, lost, or destroyed in fire, there's pointless doing that. So your data, the group one stuff, must be stored on removable media that you can store elsewhere. You could burn it onto a DVD, which was very, very popular up until 10 years ago. But these days, DVDs can only store about 4.7 gigabytes per disc, and that's not very much when you look at current photo image sizes. You won't get very many photos on that DVD. And it's a fair amount of hassle burning DVDs, and unfortunately a lot of the laptops now don't even come with a DVD drive, so you've got a problem there. You would have to buy a separate drive. So they are more trouble, but in some ways they're more permanent, because once a disk has been burned, it's fairly indestructible. The next obvious place to store your backup copies is on USB drives. What I mean by this is like flash drives or thumb drives, whatever you want to call them. The things that are like the size of your finger and that you plug into a USB port on the machine. And these days you can get them up to 32 gigabytes, 64 gigabytes and more. So they've got a lot of capacity and they're very small and very good, but they do have some problems in reliability. I mean, I've seen ones that have gone through a washing machine and a dryer and still worked, but there again, sometimes they don't if they get slightly damp. And the danger of them too is when they're sticking in a machine and sticking out, if you knock them with your knee or something and you break off the end of the USB, it's completely had it. It's irrecoverable. So they're quite fragile. They're very good for moving data around. If you've got to take some data that you're sharing with somebody else to you take it to them and they copy it off the USB onto their hard drive. It's very good for portability, but it's not the most secure for your key backups for your machine. But it's much better than nothing. So if all you ever did was copy your spreadsheets and important documents to a flash drive, it's much better than having nothing at all. The most popular one these days is to use an external hard drive because it's nearly as simple as a USB drive. It's just much bigger capacity and much more robust, and it's less likely to get lost or damaged in that sense. And the storage is relatively cheap these days. You can get a 4 terabyte drive for maybe $150. If you were trying to do that on flash drives, you'd pay an enormous amount. So per gigabyte storage is really very good. And the powered ones, they come in, external hard drives come in 2 or 3 different formats. There's ones that are called sort of portable external hard drives, which are about 2.5, 3 inches by 4.5 inches by 1/2 inch, that sort of size. And they are based on, or often based on, a 2.5 inch laptop spinning drive or on a 2.5 inch SSD, solid state drive. And they are powered just purely from the 5 volts available from a USB socket. If they're a spinning drive, it's likely that they'll be fairly slow because a 2.5 inch laptop drive runs at 5,400 RPM, whereas a 5 inch desktop drive runs at 7,200. So they are a much faster drive in transferring data and so on. But if it's an SSD portable drive, it's probably faster anyway. But I would tend to go for the bigger external drives that look more like a softback book size, that sit on your desk, and they have a 12-volt power adapter that plugs into the mains. They are the best format really for serious backups, and I say you can buy 2 or 3 terabyte ones of those for in 110, 20, 30, depends on which one you buy. And I would definitely buy the basic one. A lot of them now come with software built in, and this software that's on the hard drive installs itself the first time you plug it into your computer. And then it presents you with like a button on the desktop, which just says something like one touch backup or one button press backup or something to that effect. And what they're trying to do is they're trying to make it as easy as possible for you to make a backup, such that all they tell you need to do is click on this once a month and it will back up all your software and your data. The problem is that you don't really know what it's backing up or how it's backing it up, because come the day you might want to recover it, you're not really sure how to do that. So I would prefer to buy basically a blank external drive and then select my backup software that I will install on the machine. That way I configure the backup when it occurs, and I know exactly what it's backing up, where it's backing it up to, in what form it's backing it up, and how I would recover it if I needed to. So that's my advice, is to buy the basic drive that's just empty, no available software. It tends to be $30, $40 cheaper if you don't buy the version with the software on it. There's plenty of free software to do those backups, or you can pay for software to do it, but there's plenty of free software. And many of them are sort of industry standards, so that if you have to take it to a shop and say, my hard disk in my machine has carked it, but I do have a backup made 2 months ago, and it's either an Acronis backup, or it's a Macrium Reflect backup, or it's an Aomi backup, they will know how to restore it for you. Whereas if it's software that came with the external drive, they may not have a clue. All right, so the next section is to say, how do I store the actual media? Whatever I've chosen, where do I store it, having made the backup? And the first thing is you should keep multiple backups. Ideally, multiple devices, but even if it's on the same device, just multiple backups. So 1 month, a full backup is stored on that drive, and then the next month you don't delete the previous month's backup, you just put this month's backup next to it, and again the next month you put it next to it. After about 3 or 4 months, you decide that the very first backup you did is now too old, so you might as well delete it. But you do that rolling effect where you've always got 3 or 4 backups. If you do that on 2 different external drives, you can have one in your house, you could have one in son or daughter's house or a neighbour's house or whatever, and that's covering you for a fire or whatever. Certainly never keep your backup device, whether it's a flash drive or an external drive, never keep it next to your PC, because if you get broken into, it's more than likely they'll scoop everything up in one go and you'll lose the backups anyway. Good idea to store it in a different room from your PC, preferably somewhere innocuous like the back of your food cupboard or linen cupboard or something like that. And certainly don't leave the backup drive attached to the PC. Some people think, okay, well, I'll just leave it plugged in, and then it's easier for me to do the backup, so I can put a note to myself on a Friday to make a backup, and it's dead easy because the drive's sitting there running. But the big problem with that is if you get hit with a ransomware type encryption virus, it will encrypt all the data on your backup as well as all the data on your machine. So you will actually be no better off at all. So the advice is never leave your backup connected to the machine other than when you're actually creating the backup. So you plug it in, create the backup, unplug it, put it away. Don't leave it attached to the machine. In case of fire, you could store them, as I said, in someone else's house, particularly older backups. You can store them in a fireproof safe. if you have one. Bearing in mind a fireproof safe is only intended to survive a fire for about an hour, but it's still likely to survive the rest of the house's burning down, and it will still keep your backup safe. So that's about the storage of it. Then we come to backup frequency. How often should you make a backup copy of your data? And this comes down to really what you use your PC for. If you're not adding lots of photos every month or doing daily recording of your financial super fund or stock portfolio or whatever, then if you're not doing that, you could probably leave it for 6 months between backups. But if you're adding several hundred photos a month to your machine, or you're doing daily financial recording of any type, or you're writing your memoirs, then you've got to look more like every month rather than every 6 months. So I would, you have to come to that conclusion yourself, but I think a minimum is every 6 months. So as I say there, depends on how often your documents are changing, depends on how many photos you're adding, depends on whether you want to back up emails, because obviously a lot of people are getting and sending many emails per day, per month. But the minimum might be a full backup every 6 months. A disaster in the 5th month, you would lose 5 months of the additions. So, you've just got to make that call yourself. If a PC is high usage and frequent recording of daily or weekly data, then you would probably be better doing it every month. Incremental backups are not recommended. Now, what do I mean by incremental backups? If you made a backup on Monday, a full backup on Monday of all your information, on Tuesday, you could just back up, make a copy of the things that changed from Monday. So you wouldn't back up everything, you'd just back up those documents that you had modified or that you had added to your machine. And then on Wednesday, you do another incremental backup of things that changed in that 24 hours. So those are called incremental backups. So to get a full copy of what you have, you need the full backup plus as many incremental backups that you did. And then the idea being is that after a week or something, you do another full backup. But it's always going to be a combination of the initial full backup plus the incremental backups. Whereas if you always do full backups, you don't have to add files together or do any manipulation. The full backup is a full backup every time, and that's what I would recommend. People's data, consumer data, is not sufficient to try and do incremental or another version called differential style backups. Places like the banks and financial institutions use those techniques, but that's because the amount of data is so enormous that they can't do a full backup every night. So they do incremental or differential backups. But for a consumer, always do a full backup. And it's easier to make a full backup of chosen data. And you can use quick backups for important changing documents. What I mean by this is that if you are tracking your share portfolio and you're adding data or updating data every day, then you may choose to just create a copy of that single file in another folder, not necessarily on an external device even, but just locally create a copy every so often, every 2 or 3 days. if you were writing your memoirs, it would be well worth doing that, because what the last thing you want is to get to the last chapter only to find a file corruption has occurred and you can't open the whole document. So by making progressive copies every so often, you only may lose what was changed or added between those successive copies, which may be a day or two. So most people have learned that if you're working on a big document or an important document, best to save copies as you're going, and then you've always got something to go back to. So that's what I mean by quick backups.